And there has been a list of terminologies which still is debatable. So that is one. It depends how you look at it. Second, I want to answer one of the questions raised from the floor earlier. How about safe schools? To answer that question, I just want to say, that after the adoption of Hyogo Framework for Action, the ICR system decided we have biennial global campaigns. The first global campaign from 2006 to 2007 is on education. And for that, the slogan is, disaster risk reduction begins at schools. And at the closure of this session, at the closure of this campaign, we collected the good practices from governments, NGOs, and community-based organizations. And here is a compilation of the first global campaign for integration of disaster reduction into school. And in this book, it has been divided into 3 sessions. The first session is raising awareness within school communities. The second session is building a culture of prevention. The third session is making school buildings safer. So please check this publication. You can get good practices from many countries. I hope I answered this, how to make schools safer, the question. And next one is the relationship between human activities and natural hazards. Actually, I think I'm feeling very hungry to hear the sound of the forks and the spoons. Yes, I think that the whole idea of disaster risk reduction is trying to address the vulnerabilities of disasters. And we advocate that disasters are not natural. It's simply because it becomes a disaster because of natural hazard, the interaction between natural hazard and human activities. For example, if you, as I mentioned earlier, if you build a school on this, if you build a school on the earthquake fault belt, and that is it's possible it become a disaster. And the disaster is created, in this case, is by human activities, right? Because we know that.
Sorry, we have to interrupt that. We have a bit of an emergency. Somebody just fainted, and her name is, she's looking for her friend, May Ann. She was wearing a blue dress, and she's outside. Okay, so, okay, please take the bag to the ladies' room. Okay, please.
Can I continue? I just try to be very brief. So the human activities actually increase the vulnerability. That is because of that, we create disasters, make people vulnerable to the impact. That's why we need, let me put it that way, the disaster actually requires 3 elements. That is a hazard, vulnerability, and the capabilities. So I think that if we elaborate the details by examples, and the human activities actually is at the core to create disasters in a way. Private sector involvement in disaster risk reduction, this actually has been picked up through different initiatives. The current one is the UNEP initiative. Right now, they just started, and the objective of this initiative is to engage insurance and reinsurance companies, and through their reinsurance or insurance of disaster risks, actually try to address, to share the disaster risks or transfer disaster risks. And ICDR also just started to engage private sectors, and we basically try to do three things. Number one is to convince the private sectors to mainstream disaster risk reduction into their development activities. And the second is try to encourage them to assume their corporate social responsibilities and help communities to reduce vulnerabilities to disasters. And the last one is try to engage them, bridge the public and the private sector, and through their collaboration to actually transfer risk or manage risks or sharing risks. This is basically that my answer to the private sector involvement. The last one I want to answer is the people are very frustrated that after 20, 30 years, we are still talking about this issue. Talking about collaboration. I share your frustration. Actually, it's a very sound frustration. But I also pointed out that in the last 30 years, we have been going through an evolving process of understanding of the subject. As I mentioned earlier, or you recall, most of your governments or civil societies before the 1990s basically engaged disaster management. It's a relief response or others. But after 1990 onwards, and as I said, there is a paradigm shift from disaster management to disaster risk reduction. In certain part of the world, maybe you are advanced compared with other different parts of the world, but that does not represent the overall picture. That's why we are talking in the general terms here. I think this is the same as gender issues. I had started gender issues in 1980s. We have talking about gender issues more than 100. Actually, I even cut this newspaper slip that they were saying that 100 years ago, how the women activate and try to get, try to get themselves involved in politics. And I think that this thing is in a progress, actually in a progress way, but very slow. And I think the same thing with disaster risk reduction, because it's cross-cutting nature, it's very complicated, and it involves everyone's effort. The last one I want to mention the comment that the speaker on the floor remains skeptical on the message or slogan that disaster risk reduction is a tool for climate change adaptation. And let me just elaborate this a little bit. We say disaster risk reduction is a tool for climate change adaptation. And I want to point out the main focus of climate change adaptation, is to reduce vulnerabilities to climate change risks, to reduce the impact of climate or weather-related disasters. And that you are talking about, in accurate terms, you are talking about floods, cyclones, and drought. For this, the disaster management community or disaster risk reduction management community has already developed the different tools, the different guidelines, and that can be used right away for adapting climate change, And for this, I would say that, for example, if you use flood management guidelines, and you can build your capacity and knowledge to see how to manage the climate-induced extreme events, such as flood, drought, and others. So I just stop it here. I think I'm also feel exhausted, and I'm really hungry, and I want to go to get myself some lunch. So I leave the rest part, which has not been answered, to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feng Min Kan. I think you deserve some lunch. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the session.